Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to the first video of our dance-along, read-along of Anthony Powell's amazing 12-book series, A Dance to the Music of Time. In the month of March, we read the first book, A Question of Upbringing, and this is my video review. As this is the first one in the series, this is not going to be a spoilery review, and to be honest, because of the somewhat ambling, nostalgic, episodical nature of this series, it would be quite hard to spoil the early books. But as I imagine a lot of you watching are taking part in the read-along, I won't go into the plot or the premise or anything like that, but I will link down below my read-along announcement so you can find more out about the read-along and about the series as a whole. If you have taken part in or are taking part in my Dickens along, my previous Our Mutual Friend one and my current Bleak House one, this video is not going to be like those videos where I am talking for a very, very long time, really with a lot of like in-depth, close textual analysis. This read-along I wanted to be a bit more casual, and the videos will be a bit more casual, partly because I am like at heart a Dickens scholar, but while I adore Anthony Powell, I think I would find less in him to analyse just because I'm not used to analysing Anthony Powell, partly also because of reading a whole book rather than a few chapters, and also because I've been listening to these on audiobook, which is a slightly different reading experience. I thought instead I would structure these videos in a kind of fairly simple way. First, I'll talk about some of the things I have loved about the book of the month, then I'll talk about some of my favourite characters or the characters I think are most interesting to look at, and then I'll talk about some of the general themes in this book, and going forward I'll sort of link that through the whole series. So first, things that I really love about this book, and to be honest, partly about the whole series. One thing I love about A Question of Upbringing, and to be honest the whole series, is this real sense of nostalgia. Partly because we know from the beginning that we have a character looking back on their school days, and we don't really know quite how far they're looking back from, but the book is infused with this sense of nostalgia for the time period as well as for youth. One thing I quite enjoy is how we see first person from our narrator Nick, but we see not just his reactions as a sort of teenager and young man in this book, but we also see his reactions looking back later on. He says things like, "I didn't think this at the time," or "I didn't realise this at the time," but when he and Fairbrother part, he says, "He piled his luggage bit by bit onto a taxi and passed out of my life for some 20 years, giving us a hint that Fairbrother might turn up later in the series. I love books that are about looking back. I love the nostalgia, and I also love the way it allows Nick to give us kind of two layers of narration, both his narration and thoughts and analysis in the moment, and also that of a mature, older character in the future. Another thing I love about the series is how it's kind of plotless. I mean, it's not plotless, things happen, and over the course of the book things happen, but it's mostly about life, and it's more of a kind of extended episodical character study, which I know is possibly not for everyone, but it's something I really love. Each chapter in this book is kind of episodical. Obviously they do link, we have characters which turn up in multiple ones, Liverpool or Stringham and so on, but each chapter is quite different from the last and deals with a sort of different subplot in a way, and that's something I really enjoy about the whole series, how episodic it is, how it mirrors real life in that things don't always seem to link together until sometimes they do, and how it is focused much more on character than anything else. I'll talk in a bit about some of my favourite characters and some of the characters I think are most interesting, but I think Anthony Powell has a brilliant eye for creating characters wonderfully, for getting someone really strongly across in such a wonderful way, and for creating characters who are, though at times a little bit absurd, also inherently for me believable, and that's why I think he feels like a cross between Dickens and Evelyn Waugh for me. Le Bar, for example, ridiculous, but also slightly believable. Another thing I love about the series, which I know I've mentioned before, is how, although it is a character study, it is not, for the most part, a character study of the main character. Of course, Nick Jenkins, our narrator, is very important, and we do get to learn a lot about him, though often it's through the way he perceives other things rather than about his own life. We know about his Uncle Giles because his Uncle Giles is analysed in this, but we know very little about his parents. Nick's ambition to be a writer is present in this book not because it tells us that Nick wants to be a writer, but because Widmerpool's reaction to it is what Nick finds interesting. The fact that Widmerpool thinks this is a very bad idea. Because I love that although we get to find out about our narrator by the way he analyses and sees the world, for the most part the book focuses on other characters. I think that's a really interesting way of doing a book. It's something I really enjoy, and it's something I think is wonderfully effective. I also love how self-reflective and kind of full of thought the book is, how often Nick analyses characters around him, both, as I mentioned earlier, sort of from a present day perspective and from his sort of future self looking back on these events. I find it really interesting, and for me it makes it a real joy to read. I also just love the time period. I think I find the 20s and sort of the immediate post-war period really interesting, especially in terms of the way that These are all young men who didn't fight in the war, and a lot of men just a little bit older than them did fight in the war. The way that they feel slightly separated from them, the way that that affects their lives, and also the way that for older men there is a big sort of division between people who fought in the war and people who didn't. For example, Stripling and Fairbrother. I find the time period so interesting, especially the way that like upper class public schools worked in that time period. It's such a weird, odd world, but I find it really interesting to read about, especially because the 20s and 30s is a time period in Britain where the way class operated was quite dramatically changing. And so how these upper class boys from this public school fit into this is quite interesting. So those are some things that I love about this book, and bear with me saying this wouldn't be a long video. I do want to talk about some of my favourite characters. I think my favourite character, possibly in the whole series as a whole, is Charles Stringham. I just think he's wonderful. I think he's such a brilliant creation. I love him and Templar together as Nick's friends because at first glance they seem fairly similar, but actually the more you get to know them you see how different they are, especially as their relationship develops. Stringham has at times reminded me of Sebastian in Brideshead Revisited. Another reason, I suppose, why I often associate Anthony Powell with Evelyn Waugh. I don't know quite what it is about Stringham and Sebastian, but Stringham for me is such an interesting character, partly in the sort of draw he has for Nick, partly in his changing moods and the sort of implications of some sort of mental health problems or issues with depression, and partly for his odd family setup and the way that power works in that family setup and how he attempts to find it. He's a very intriguing character, and his relationship with Nick, which we see in this book sort of grow to its height of closeness and then decline towards the end of the book, is something I find really interesting. Templar is another character that I find fascinating. His flippantness is really interesting, and another thing that crops up in this book, though it kind of is a background issue, is Templar's bisexuality. Another pupil at the school was previously sent down for sending an immoral note to Templar, and afterwards Wimberpool cornered Templar to give him a lecture on morals, after which Templar thought that Wimberpool might be about to start something himself. It's pretty clear that Templar and this boy who got expelled from the school were having some kind of relationship. Templar is also very, very vocal about his relationships with women, and the way that like Templar as a figure kind of explores the theme of sex and sexuality within this book is really, really interesting. I don't think it's a coincidence that the first sort of woman Nick finds attractive is Templar's sister, in part because Templar for him represents that world of sexuality and relationships which he does not feel he is a part of at all. Of course I want to talk about Wimberpool because I think he's a really interesting character. He is the first character we see in focus in the book, and we almost see Wimberpool in greater focus than we see Nick. He is so fully realised and so interesting, his ambitions, his drive, his awkwardness, but also the lack of self-consciousness he feels at his awkwardness, which all together makes him such an interesting figure. And Nick feels both kind of drawn to him and also slightly disgusted by him in what I find a really interesting way. And I think Nick has a kind of similar feeling towards Quiggin, though perhaps a slightly fonder one. Quiggin is a really interesting character, and I'll talk about him a bit more as the series go on. And Nick is fascinated with him in part because he is so different to all of the very, very upper class people around them, although it isn't clear if Quiggin is also setting himself out to be slightly lower down in the social spectrum than he actually is. Quiggin and Wimberpool are presented as being in some ways similar. They are both slightly awkward but unaware of their own awkwardness or how awkward they make other people feel, but also there is a kind of big difference to them in that Wimberpool is very, very hard working but never seems to have much to show for it, for example in all of his exercise and sporting efforts at school, whereas Quiggin talks constantly about his work at university but doesn't seem to be really doing it. There are so many more characters from this book I could pick out to talk about in detail, but before I move on to talking about the themes of this book, I do quickly want to talk about the character of Sillery. Mel from Mel's Bookland Adventures, whose channel I'll link down below, tweeted at me on Twitter that she found Sillery really quite like Professor Slughorn in Harry Potter. And it's really, really very true. Like, they are so uncannily similar that I think I'd probably agree with Mel that maybe J.K. Rowling has read A Dance for the Musical Time and modelled Slughorn on Sillery, because the way in which Sillery collects his students and is interested in people that might go on to have influence in the future, and the way he cares in a way much more for influence and the influence he can have through his influential students than he does for the students themselves is really, really interesting. Another thing that I think is interesting, just to quickly talk about the role that Sillery's tea parties play, is that we get a sense of the importance and the influential nature of all of the people at Sillery's tea party, except Nick himself. Why is he there? Why does Celery take an interest in him? We don't really know because we're given so little about Nick himself. We only even find out that Nick is studying history because Celery points out that Quiggin studies history as well. Our narrator himself never gives us that information. Moving on a little bit to a couple of interesting themes in this book. One theme I want to touch on, though I know I've mentioned it earlier, is that of post-war society. This book is set in the early 1920s, and we do see in many ways shadows of the First World War. Partly it is in the way that different characters react to each other. As I already mentioned, the sort of antagonism between Stripling, who didn't fight in the war, and every other man who did fight in the war. Nick is always surprised that people seem to know his father from during the war, and many characters seem to have previous relationships and bonds formed in the war, and to have their characters and their careers formed in the war. I think it's very interesting to look at the way that the early books in A Dance to the Music of Time look at the fallout from and the shadow of the First World War, especially because this is a book that spans a long period of time right up until the 70s and covers the Second World War as well. A very important theme in this book is of course that of growing up and things changing and things ending. We get to see what is almost the start of Nick's friendship with Stringham and Templar, him growing close to them, and then as they leave school, that kind of falling apart. Nick kind of mourns the loss of his friends and the loss of the world he loses with them. It's interesting that this book ends in a way with shutting down school. Even though Nick leaves school less than halfway through the book, it's only the ending of the book where he has this kind of closing meeting with Stringham and also with his old school teacher, Labar. The era of school doesn't seem to end for him until he is halfway through his university degree, and that's when he begins to feel that he is growing up. I mentioned earlier the kind of themes of sex and sexuality and love and relationships. I think it's important that Nick feels very left out of the world of relationships that his friends all seem to be in, and is quite uncomfortable with it. He has that gloriously awkward moment where he tries to declare his affection for Suzette and ends up just telling the wrong woman and just kind of goes with it because he doesn't know what else to do. He feels very clueless, and the fact for him that he feels very clueless means that he feels like he is less grown up than the other men around him. Before I wrap this video up, another theme I quickly want to mention is that of kind of outsiders. One thing I've always found very interesting in A Dance to the Music of Time is the particular characters which Nick, the narrator, focuses on and is kind of drawn to, though at times also not drawn to. And I think it's interesting to look at Widmerpool and Quiggin as examples of outsiders within the social groups that they are in. Widmerpool doesn't fit in at school. Quiggin, if only because of his class background, doesn't really fit in at the university. And Nick, even though he doesn't necessarily like these characters, is drawn to think about them and to analyse them and to work over them in his head. Partly, I think, because they are outsiders, and that's something I'll talk about as the series goes on as well. But I think it's interesting as well that Nick is often presented as an outsider. He feels like Stringham and Templar are closer to each other than they are to him, and is quite surprised when visiting Stringham's house when Stringham makes a comment that suggests that actually him and Templar aren't as close as Nick always thought. And throughout the book, Nick is kind of on the outside looking in. He is observing all of these things, and although he takes a slightly active part, his role is often diminished. Throughout the whole series, often when Nick is having a conversation with another character, the other character's dialogue will be directly reported, whereas Nick's will be in free indirect speech. Obviously, Nick does have a lot of direct dialogue in the book, but there are also several passages where there are long conversations where we hear the direct speech of the other character, but we don't hear Nick's direct words. He presents himself as a kind of outsider, if only because he is observing everyone else in a way from a slightly detached perspective. I think that's all I had to say about this book. Please let me know down in the comments if you're taking part in the read-along how you enjoyed it. I love this series a lot, and I'm really, really excited to read on with the rest with you all, and I really hope that you enjoyed this first book. I know they're weird and episodical and very, very character driven and sometimes quite meandering, but I love that about them, and I hope that some of you did too. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.